The old basilica at Saint-Denis was dark. It was a solid, thick-walled Romanesque church built to feel like a fortress for God. His light struggled to get through the small, high windows. Abbot Suger walked through it in the 1130s and felt a deep dissatisfaction. He was a man of great ambition, not just for himself, but for his abbey, the burial place of French kings. He believed that light was the physical manifestation of the divine. To fill a church with light was to fill it with God's presence. He decided to rebuild the choir and the west front. The work began in 1140. Suger's vision was radical. He wanted to do away with the heavy, load-bearing walls. He wanted to replace them with a slender stone skeleton of pointed arches and ribbed vaults. This new style, which we now call Gothic, would open up vast spaces between the columns. These spaces would be filled not with stone, but with colored glass. He called it Lux Nova, or New Light. This wasn't just decoration, it was theology made visible. To achieve this, Suger brought the best artisans from across France and beyond. Well, workshops were set up right there on the grounds of the abbey. Masons chipped away at limestone, sculptors carved prophets and saints, and in a dedicated building, the master glaziers and their teams went to work. The scale of the project was enormous. For the new choir alone, consecrated in 1144, there were 25 huge windows. Some of them were over 20 feet tall. The process was slow and expensive. The master glazier would first consult with Suger or his clerks to understand the theological story each window was supposed to tell. A small sketch would be made on parchment. Then, this sketch was scaled up to a full-size drawing, a cartoon laid out on a huge whitewashed wooden table. The master drew the entire design in charcoal, marking every piece of glass and the dark lines of the lead that would hold them together. Glass itself was a precious commodity. It was made in forest workshops where firewood was plentiful. Sand, potash from burnt wood, and a stabilizer like lime were melted in a clay pot inside a furnace that burned for days. To get the colors, metallic oxides were added to the molten mix. A pinch of cobalt oxide, imported at great cost, created a deep, brilliant blue. Air copper oxide made a ruby red so dark it had to be made as a thin layer, or flash, on top of clear glass, otherwise no light would pass through it. The glaziers at Saint-Denis received this glass in rough sheets and randles. They laid a piece of colored glass over the corresponding shape on the cartoon. They couldn't cut it with a diamond cutter. That was a later invention. Instead, they used a hot iron. They would heat the tip of an iron rod in a small furnace, then touch it to the glass. The thermal shock would create a crack. They would guide this crack along the desired line with the hot iron, or by touching the glass with a wet finger or a piece of cloth dipped in cold water. It was an imprecise art. Once the rough shape was cracked out, they used a grozing iron, a tool with a notched head, to nibble away at the edges, shaping the piece exactly to the line on the cartoon. The sound in the workshop was a constant rhythmic crunching. Once all the pieces for a panel were cut, the painter would take over. Using a fine brush, he would paint the details, faces, folds of cloth, hands, and letters. The paint wasn't like oil paint. It was a mix of finely ground copper or iron oxide, powdered glass, and a binder like wine or vinegar. The glazier painted this onto the surface of the colored glass. Then the pieces were placed in a kiln and fired. The heat melted the powdered glass in the paint, fusing the metallic oxides permanently to the surface of the host glass. It became a part of the glass itself. The final assembly was a puzzle. The glazier took strips of lead called cames. These cames had an H-shaped cross-section. He would lay a piece of glass into one of the channels of the H, then bend the lead around it, fitting the next piece of glass into the opposite channel. He worked his way across the panel, cutting the lead strips and fitting the glass according to the cartoon underneath. At every point where two or more lead cames met, he would apply a drop of tallow as a flux, then touch it with a hot soldering iron. A puff of smoke, a hiss, and the joint was sealed with a blob of molten tin lead solder. This was the work that filled the new choir of Saint-Denis. When the scaffolding came down and light poured through the Tree of Jesse window and the Life of Christ panels for the first time, it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The stone seemed to dissolve into a vibrant, glowing tapestry of sacred stories. Suger had created his theology of light. The techniques his craftsmen used, the cartoon, the cutting with heat and grossing, the vitreous painting, the leading and soldering were not all new, but at Saint-Denis they were perfected and used on a scale that kicked off a century-spanning competition of cathedral building. These same fundamental methods, mastered in a dusty workshop in the 1140s, are the ones still used by a stained glass artist today. Number 10, the unseen iron skeleton is the window's true strength. Jean Le Forgeron did not work with glass. He worked with iron. It was 12:15 and he stood on the wooden scaffolding clinging to the rising stone walls of Chartres Cathedral. Below him, the town was a jumble of roofs. Around him, masons were setting stones, their hammers tapping out a constant rhythm. Jean's own work was just as important, but it would be mostly invisible. He was the blacksmith responsible for the armatures, the iron framework that would hold the massive new windows in place. The master glazier, a quiet man named Thierry, had shown him the cartoons. They were bigger than any window Jean had ever worked on. The clerestory windows were over 40 feet high. They were not single objects, they were a mosaic of hundreds of small pieces of glass held together by a fragile web of soft lead. A single large panel of this glass and lead was incredibly heavy. A strong gust of wind could bow it inwards, cracking the glass and breaking the solder joints. Without support, the window would destroy itself. Jean's job was to build a skeleton of iron to prevent that from happening. He worked from Thierry's cartoon, which not only showed the glass and lead lines, but also the placement of the support bars. In his smoky forge, set up a short distance from the main construction site, he and his apprentices heated long iron bars in the charcoal fire. When a bar glowed orange-red, they would pull it out and lay it on the anvil. The air rang with the clang of hammers. There were two main types of support. First came the main frame, the T-bars. These were heavy, thick bars of iron that divided the huge window opening into more manageable sections. Jean had to forge these to the exact dimensions of the stone opening. He would measure, heat, and hammer the bars into shape. At the end, he would forge a flat pintle, a sort of peg that would be set directly into the mortar between the stones of the window frame. These T-bars formed the primary grid, the big squares or rectangles that would each hold a single large stained glass panel. Forging a perfect right-angle joint where two T-bars met was a mark of great skill. He would heat the two ends, cut a notch in each, and then hammer them together to form a strong, interlocking joint. But even these large panels were too flimsy to support themselves. So Jean created the second type of support, the saddle bars. These were smaller, round or square iron bars that ran horizontally across each panel. He forged dozens of them, each one cut to the precise width of the panel it would support. Where the bar crossed a lead line, the glazier would attach the panel to it using a small copper wire. The wire was soldered directly to the lead, came on one end, and twisted tightly around the saddle bar on the other. Jean spent a long morning forging a set of saddle bars for a panel depicting a prophet. He measured the bar against the mark on the cartoon, cut it with a hot chisel, and then hammered the end into a shape that would fit snugly into a hole drilled in the stone mullion. He worked with a quiet intensity. He knew that the weight of the panel would press down on these bars. He knew the wind would push against them. If his iron was weak, if his welds were poor, the window would fail. Later that week, he was back up on the scaffolding with Thierry's men. They were ready to install the first panels of the North Rose window. It was a terrifyingly complex job. The panels were heavy and awkward. The glaziers hoisted them up with ropes and pulleys. Jean was there to guide the panels into place and secure the armatures. He watched as two apprentices carefully maneuvered a panel into its opening in the iron T-bar frame. Once it was seated, Jean took one of the saddle bars he had forged. He fitted one end into the hole in the stone frame. Then another apprentice handed him a bucket of hot liquid lead. Jean carefully poured the lead into the hole around the end of the iron bar. It would cool and harden, locking the bar permanently in place. He did the same on the other side. The panel was now braced. He looked at the work. From the inside of the cathedral, people would barely notice his iron bars. They would seem like part of the lead lines, part of the design. The glory would go to the glazier, to the man who made the saints, and angels glow with divine color. But Jean knew the truth. He knew that without his heavy black iron, the beautiful delicate glass would be nothing more than a pile of colorful shards on the floor after the first winter storm. His skeleton was the hidden strength that allowed the light to live. This same principle holds today. A modern stained glass artist, creating a large window, still relies on a system of steel or bronze reinforcing bars set into the frame and tied to the lighted panel, a technique of support that a blacksmith like Jean Le Forgeron mastered 800 years ago. Number 9, the final messy task, guarantees 500 years of life. Thomas was 15. He was not a glazier, not yet. He was an apprentice, and for the last 6 months, his primary job had been sweeping the workshop floor, tending the charcoal brazier for the soldering irons, and running errands for the master, a stern man named Gilbert. This was 1380, and their workshop in Norwich was busy, filling commissions for the many wealthy wool churches in the county. Today, Thomas was being given a new responsibility. It was the messiest, smelliest, and least glamorous job in the entire process of making a window. He was going to learn how to cement a panel. Master Gilbert had just finished soldering the final joint on a panel showing St. Margaret slaying a dragon. It was beautiful. The saint's blue robe was the color of a summer sky. The dragon's scales were a mix of deep greens and murky purples. The ruby glass of the dragon's blood, made with a secret formula including gold, was worth more than Thomas would earn in a year. The panel lay flat on a large workbench, but it was not yet a window. It was flimsy. If you picked it up, it would sag and bend. The gaps between the lead flanges and the glass were not yet sealed. It was not weatherproof. A hard rain would drive right through it. Gilbert pointed to a stone trough in the corner of the workshop. "Time you learned, boy," he said. "Mix the cement." He provided no further instructions. Thomas had watched the older apprentices do it. He knew the ingredients. He scooped a measure of fine, dry chalk powder, what they called whiting, into the trough. He added a scoop of lampblack, the fine soot scraped from the inside of a lamp, to give the cement its dark gray color. And then he unstoppered a jug of linseed oil. He poured a small amount in and began to mix it with his hands. Too little oil, and it would be a dry powder. Too much, and it would be a runny mess. He worked the black, greasy putty for nearly an hour, his hands and forearms covered in the stuff. Finally, it reached the consistency of thick dough. Gilbert came over, picked up a lump, and squeezed it. He grunted, which Thomas took as approval. Now for the application. Gilbert showed him how to take a lump of the cement and scrub it onto the surface of the stained glass panel using a stiff bristled brush. "Hard," Gilbert commanded. "Force it under the lead. Every gap. No empty spaces." Thomas put his back into it. He scrubbed the greasy cement all over the beautiful glass. He was covering up St. Margaret's face, smearing black putty over the carefully painted details. It felt wrong, like vandalism. He worked his way across the entire panel, pushing the cement deep into the channels of the lead cames. He did one side, then carefully, with the help of another apprentice, they flipped the heavy panel over, and he did the other. When he was finished, the entire panel was an opaque, black, greasy mess. The colors were gone, hidden under a thick layer of cement. "Now you clean it," Gilbert said. Thomas took handfuls of dry whiting powder and threw it onto the panel. The powder absorbed the excess linseed oil. He then used his brush to scrub the panel again, this time with the dry powder. Slowly, the surface cement began to come away, leaving only what had been forced under the lead. After scrubbing, he used a small wooden or bone stick, called a fid, to carefully scrape away the cement that was sitting on the lead itself, cleaning up the lines. It took the rest of the day. It was painstaking, repetitive work. His shoulders ached. But as he cleaned, the window began to re-emerge from the grime. The blue of the robe shone again. The dragon's eye, a single perfect piece of yellow glass, reappeared. By the time the sun was setting, the panel was clean. He picked it up. It was transformed. It was no longer a flimsy, rattling assembly. It was a single, solid, rigid unit. He could tap the glass, and it felt firm. It was now waterproof and strong. The cement had sealed it and braced every piece of glass against its neighbor. Master Gilbert inspected his work. He ran a finger along a lead line. He held the panel up to the last of the light. He set it down. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to a tiny smudge near the dragon's tail. Thomas's heart sank, but then Gilbert cracked a rare, thin smile. "Do it again tomorrow. You'll get it right." And Thomas knew then that he had passed the test. He had learned the smelly, dirty secret that turned a fragile piece of art into an object that could withstand the wind and rain of Norfolk for centuries. Modern restorers and artists still use this same technique. The putty composition might be slightly different with added solvents, but the basic principle of forcing an oil-based cement into the lead channels to waterproof and strengthen the panel is identical to the messy job Thomas learned in 1380. Number 8. The solder joint is where art and alchemy meet. William of York considered himself more than just a craftsman. In his mind, he was a practitioner of a subtle art, a master of fire and metal. It was 1425, and his workshop, just a short walk from the towering New Minster, was one of the most respected in the north of England. He was known for the quality of his soldering. Anyone could learn to cut glass or slap paint on it, but the true test of a master glazier, he believed, was in the joints. A stained glass window was a collection of weaknesses. Every single place where one piece of lead met another was a potential point of failure. A bad solder joint could crack under the strain of the window's own weight. It could corrode over time, allowing water to seep in. A sloppy joint was ugly, a lump of metal that interrupted the flow of the design. A perfect joint was a small, smooth, rounded bead of metal, strong enough to last 1,000 years, and neat enough to be part of the art. Today, William was finishing a panel for the Great East Window of York Minster, a project of biblical scale that had occupied the city's glaziers for years. The panel on his bench depicted an angel, its wings a complex pattern of dozens of small, feather-like pieces of white and gold glass. His apprentices had cut the glass and assembled the panel, fitting the pieces into the lead cames. Now it was William's turn to lock it all together. His soldering station was simple. A small charcoal brazier sat on a stone slab, its embers glowing a dull red. Sticking out of the embers were his soldering irons. They were not electric. They were heavy pieces of copper attached to an iron rod with a wooden handle. The copper tip, shaped like a wedge, held the heat. Beside the brazier was a small pot of tallow, rendered animal fat, which he used as flux, and coiled nearby were thin strips of his solder. The composition of the solder was William's own secret, a recipe he had perfected over 20 years. He knew that pure lead melted at too high a temperature and would melt the cames themselves. Pure tin was too expensive and brittle. The perfect solder was an alloy of the two. William used a mix that was close to 60 parts tin and 40 parts lead. This alloy had a special property. It had a lower melting point than either metal on its own. It allowed him to work quickly, melting the solder without risking the lead came structure. He began his work. With a pair of tongs, he pulled a hot iron from the brazier. He tested its heat by touching it to a lump of tallow which should sizzle but not burst into flames. The temperature had to be just right. Too cool and the solder would not flow properly, creating a weak, cold joint. Too hot, and it could melt a hole right through the lead came. He judged the temperature by feel, by smell, by instinct. He moved to the panel. At the first intersection of lead cames, he dabbed a tiny amount of tallow onto the joint with a small brush. The tallow would clean the surface of the lead and help the molten solder flow smoothly. He then touched the tip of the hot iron to the joint to heat it, and in the same instant, he touched the end of his solder strip to the iron. A small bead of solder melted and flowed instantly, drawn by the heat and the flux into a perfect hemispherical dome covering the joint. The whole operation took less than 2 seconds. A small puff of greasy smoke rose, and the joint was made. He worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, iron from the fire, dab of flux, touch of solder, and on to the next joint. He did not think his hands knew what to do. He soldered a junction where 5 separate lead lines met, a complex and critical point. He built up the solder carefully, ensuring it bonded to every surface. He was not just sticking the leads together, he was creating a single fused metal structure. An apprentice watched him, mesmerized by the efficiency of his movements. The apprentice had tried soldering. His joints were either lumpy and ugly, or they were thin and weak. He often overheated the lead, leaving a puckered, nearly melted mess. William worked with the grace of a musician. His control over the heat was absolute. He finished one side of the panel, then placed the hot iron back in the brazier to reheat, and picked up another. He would go through all the joints on one side, then the panel would be carefully flipped, and he would do the other side. Each panel had hundreds of such joints. It was hours of intense, focused work. But when he was done, the web of lead was no longer just a container for the glass. It was a single, interconnected structure. The angel's wing was now strong, its form locked in place by dozens of William's small, perfect solder joints. An artist today uses an electric soldering iron for convenience, but the materials and the goal are unchanged. They still use a tin lead alloy solder, they still use a flux, and they still strive to create that same strong, neat, perfectly flowed joint that William of York perfected 6 centuries ago. Number 7, the soft, heavy metal is both the line and the structure. Alaric was a journeyman glazier. He had completed his 7-year apprenticeship in London, and now, in 1180, he had traveled to Canterbury. The great cathedral was a hive of activity. A fire in 1174 had destroyed the choir, and a massive rebuilding project was underway. The finest craftsmen in Europe were here, and Alaric hoped to prove his worth among them. His new master, a Frenchman named Guillaume, set him to work not with glass, but with lead. For weeks, his entire world was the sight, feel, and smell of this dull, heavy metal. The lead came was the heart of a stained glass window. It was the black line that defined the image, but it was also the structural channel that held each piece of glass. Creating these cames was a craft in itself. In Alaric's workshop, they used a new, but still laborious method. First, they melted down scrap lead in a large iron cauldron over a roaring fire. Once it was liquid, they would pour it into a 2-part stone or iron mold. The mold was carved with long U-shaped channels. When they poured the lead in and put the other half of the mold on top, it cast a rough, solid bar of lead with 2 flanges sticking out. Alaric's job was to take these rough cast lead strips and turn them into usable cames. He would take one of the cooled gray bars and feed it into a small mill. This was a device with 2 hand-cranked rollers. He would turn the crank, and another apprentice would pull the lead strip through the rollers. The pressure stretched the lead and squeezed it into a more refined H shape. It was hard physical work. The lead was soft, but it resisted. They would have to pass it through the mill several times, slightly tightening the rollers each time to get it to the right thickness and profile. Guillaume was fanatically particular about his lead. He had Alaric create cames in at least 3 different widths. There was the wide, heavy lead for the outer borders of a panel, which had to be strong. There was a standard width came for most of the interior lines. And there was a very fine, delicate lead for intricate details like the fingers on a hand or the pattern on a piece of fabric. Working with this fine lead was a nightmare, as it was very easy to stretch or break. After the cames were milled, Alaric would have to stretch them. He would nail one end of a 5-foot length of cane to a wooden board and pull on the other end with a pair of pliers. This did 2 things. It straightened the cane, removing any kinks from the milling process, and it worked hard in the lead, making it slightly stiffer and stronger. Finally, he was allowed to work on a real panel. Guillaume was assembling a window showing the ancestors of Christ. The cartoon was on the table, and the cut pieces of glass were laid out in trays. Alaric's job was to cut the lead and fit the glass. He took a length of cane and laid it along a line on the cartoon. He placed the first piece of glass, a deep blue piece for a robe, into the channel of the lead. Then he took his lead knife, a tool with a sharp steel blade and a weighted end, and cut the cane to the correct length. He would press down and rock the blade to make a clean cut. He then bent the lead around the glass. He picked up the next piece of glass and fitted it into the other side of the H channel. He slowly built up the design, piece by piece, line by line. It was like drawing, but his pen was a strip of soft metal. He learned how to use the lead to his advantage. A wider lead could be used to obscure a slightly imperfect cut in the glass. He learned how to make smooth, flowing curves by gently teasing the lead into shape with his fingers and a wooden tool called a fid. Where one lead met another, he had to cut the flange away so the heart of the lead would sit flush against the other cane, ready for soldering. Alaric spent his days surrounded by the metallic scent of lead. His hands were perpetually gray from handling it. But he began to understand its nature. It was soft enough to be shaped by hand, yet strong enough, once soldered into a network, to hold 100 pounds of glass against a gale. He saw how the dark lines were not just necessary evils, they were a vital part of the artistic composition, creating the rhythm and structure of the image. The lead lines were the bones, the glass was the flesh. Modern stained glass artists no longer cast their own lead. They buy it ready-made from specialized factories, extruded by machines into a vast array of profiles. But the process of cutting it with a lead knife, bending it around the glass, and assembling the panel piece by piece is exactly the same as the work Alaric did in the shadow of Canterbury Cathedral over 800 years ago. Number 6, the secret recipe for black paint was written down by a monk. In a quiet scriptorium, likely somewhere in northwestern Germany, a monk sat hunched over a sheet of parchment. It was the early 12th century, perhaps around 1120. His name, or the name he chose to write under, was Theophilus Presbyter. He was not just a man of God, he was a master craftsman, a skilled metalworker, painter, and glass artist. And he was doing something remarkable, something that went against the grain of the secretive guild traditions of his time. He was writing everything down. His book, De Diversis Artibus, on the various arts, was a detailed, practical manual for craftsmen. In it, he laid bare the secrets of his trade, including the precise method for making and using vitreous paint, the black enamel that gave life and detail to stained glass. Theophilus's chapter on glass painting is not a theoretical text. It is a direct step-by-step guide written by a man whose hands were familiar with the materials. He begins with the recipe for the paint itself. He instructs the reader to take pieces of copper and burn them in a small iron pot until they are reduced to a fine powder. This would create copper oxide. He then advises to take pieces of green glass or Greek sapphire, likely a type of blue glass, and grind them very finely on a porphyry slab. This ground glass is what modern artists call frit. The next step, according to Theophilus, is to mix the copper oxide powder and the ground glass powder together in a proportion of 2 parts copper to 1 part glass. This was the paint. To use it, he writes, one should take this dry powder and temper it in a cup with wine or urine. The liquid acted as a binder, allowing the powder to be painted onto the surface of the glass. Imagine a glazier in a Benedictine monastery workshop following these instructions. He has just cut a piece of pale blue glass that will be the face of a saint. He takes a small amount of the black powder mixture and puts it on a glass palette. He adds a few drops of wine and mixes it with a finger or a small brush until it is a smooth flowing ink. This is his tracing paint. Using a fine-tipped brush, probably made from badger or sable hair, he lays the piece of blue glass over the cartoon and carefully paints the main lines of the face, the outline of the head, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the lines of the beard. He paints with a steady hand, following the charcoal lines on the table below. Theophilus describes this as the first and most important stage. But a simple outline is not enough to create a sense of depth and form. Theophilus then describes a second stage. The glazier would take the same paint mixture but dilute it further, creating a thinner, more transparent wash. This is called a motte. He would cover the entire piece of glass with this thin wash of paint. Once it was dry, he would use a variety of tools to create shading and highlights. He could use a stiff brush called a scrub to stipple the mat, creating a textured, semi-transparent shadow. He could use the wooden end of his brush handle to scratch fine lines through the dry mat, creating highlights in the hair or beard. This technique of painting on a mat and then selectively removing it is what gives medieval faces their characteristic depth and expressiveness. The final step was the most crucial. The painted pieces of glass were carefully laid out on a tray covered with a layer of ash or lime to prevent them from sticking. The tray was then placed inside a kiln. Theophilus describes building such a kiln with layers of wood and charcoal. The glazier would heat the kiln until it glowed red, reaching a temperature of around 650 degrees Celsius, 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the ground glass or frit in the paint mixture would melt. As it melted, it would fuse the copper oxide pigment permanently to the surface of the host glass. When the kiln cooled, the painted lines were no longer on the glass, they were part of the glass. They could not be scraped off or washed away. Thanks to Theophilus, this knowledge was not lost. His manuscript was copied and passed down through monastic and cathedral workshops. A modern artist making a stained glass window follows almost the exact same procedure. They may use iron oxide instead of copper for a warmer black, and their binder might be water-based gum arabic or an oil. Their kiln is electric and digitally controlled for perfect accuracy, but the paint itself is still a simple mixture of metallic oxide and powdered glass, and the technique of tracing, matting, and firing to fuse the paint to the glass is the ancient art that Theophilus so carefully recorded 9 centuries ago. Number 5, a happy accident in a 14th century kiln created golden light. For the first 200 years of the Gothic era, if a glazier wanted yellow in his window, he had to use a piece of yellow glass. If he wanted to depict a person with blonde hair wearing a white robe, he would have to cut a separate piece of yellow glass for the hair and lead it to the clear glass of the robe. This was difficult, especially for small details. It made designs more complex and cluttered with lead lines. Then sometime around the year 1300, a discovery was made in a workshop, likely in Normandy or Paris, that changed everything. It was a new material, a kind of paint that could turn clear glass into a brilliant, transparent yellow. It was called silver stain. Let's imagine a glazier named Jean in Paris around 1310. He is a man open to new ideas. He has heard rumors from other glaziers of this new technique. A traveling merchant sells him a small packet of a curious substance, a silver compound, likely silver nitrate or silver sulfide, mixed with a carrier like yellow ochre clay. The merchant tells him to paint it on the back of the glass and fire it. Jean is skeptical. He is used to his vitreous paint, the dark, opaque mixture of iron oxide and glass frit that he uses for tracing lines. That paint is applied to the front of the glass. This new stuff is different. He takes a scrap of clear glass. He mixes the silver and clay powder with a little water to make a thin paste. Using a brush, he paints a simple design, a small star, on one side of the glass. He lets it dry. He is firing a batch of other pieces that day, pieces he has painted with his traditional black tracing paint. He places the test piece in the kiln along with the others, but he has been told this new stain requires a lower temperature. So he puts the test piece in a cooler part of the kiln. He heats the kiln, waits for it to reach the correct temperature for the black paint to fuse, and then lets it cool slowly overnight. The next morning he opens the kiln, he pulls out the test piece. The clay he painted on the back is still there, a crusty yellowish residue. He scrapes it off with his fingernail. Underneath, the glass is unchanged. It is still clear. He is disappointed. The merchant was a fraud. He almost throws the piece away, but something makes him hold it up to the light of the workshop window. He gasps. Where he had painted the star, the clear glass is now suffused with a pale, luminous, perfect yellow. It is not a layer of paint on the surface. The glass itself has changed color. It is completely transparent. The light shines through it as if it were a piece of solid yellow glass. He has created color without pigment. What Jean didn't know was that he had stumbled upon a chemical miracle. When the silver compound is heated to about 550 to 600 degrees Celsius, the silver ions migrate from the clay carrier into the surface of the glass. There, they replace the sodium ions in the glass matrix. These tiny colloidal particles of silver embedded within the glass itself interact with light in a way that produces a yellow color. If the firing is a little hotter or longer, the color deepens to orange or even a reddish brown. This discovery spread through the workshops of Europe like wildfire. It was a revolution. Now, a glazier could use a single piece of clear glass to depict a golden crown on a king's head, which was itself on clear glass. He could paint yellow patterns on a blue robe without having to cut dozens of tiny, fiddly pieces of yellow glass. He could even achieve subtle shading effects by varying the thickness of the silver stain application. The technique transformed stained glass art. Windows became lighter and more painterly. Artists could create more complex and delicate images. The golden halos of saints, the flowing hair of angels, the rich brocades of royal robes, all were now possible with a new subtlety and ease. This technique, born from experimentation and perhaps a lucky accident in a kiln 700 years ago, is still a fundamental part of the stained glass artist's toolkit. Silver stain is still made from a silver compound mixed with a clay base. It is still painted on the back of the glass, and it is still fired in a kiln to produce that same magical, transparent, permanent gold. Number 4, the sound of a grozing iron is the sound of patience. Conrad's workshop in Cologne was cold. In the winter of 1260, a small charcoal brazier did little to warm the stone-floored room, but Conrad barely noticed. His entire attention was focused on the small piece of ruby red glass in his left hand. It was a precious material, this red glass. It was made by adding copper oxide to the molten glass, but the process was notoriously difficult to control. The result was a glass so dark that it appeared almost black. To make it usable, the glassmakers would dip a gather of clear molten glass into the pot of red, creating a thin flash of red on a clear base. This flashed glass was expensive and unforgiving. Conrad's task was to cut a shape for the robe of a martyred saint. The shape on the cartoon was a complex curve. 100 years earlier, a glazier might have simplified the shape or used several smaller, simpler pieces of glass. But the standards of craftsmanship were higher now. The patrons demanded elegance and realism. He placed the red glass flash side up on the cartoon. He could see the charcoal line through the clear base. The first step was to score the glass. He couldn't use a diamond. That tool was still centuries in the future. He used a hot iron point. He took a thin iron rod from the brazier, its tip glowing a dull cherry red. With a quick, confident movement, he drew the hot tip along the charcoal line. A tiny, almost invisible crack appeared in the surface of the glass. This was the line of weakness. He then tapped the glass from underneath, along the score line. With a sharp crack, a large piece broke away. But the break was not clean. It followed the general curve, but it was jagged and rough, several millimeters away from the true line he needed. Now came the real work. He picked up his grozing iron. It was a simple tool, a short bar of iron with a notched slot like a key at each end, one larger than the other. He placed the edge of the glass into the larger slot. With a twisting motion of his wrist, he broke off a small piece of the excess glass. Crunch. He moved the iron a fraction of an inch and did it again. Crunch. This was grozing. He was not cutting the glass, he was nibbling it, crushing away the edge in tiny increments. It was a slow, methodical, and nerve-wracking process. Each crunch was a calculated risk. If he applied too much pressure or twisted at the wrong angle, a crack could shoot across the entire piece, ruining it. A piece of glass this size represented a day's wages for a skilled laborer. A mistake was costly. Conrad worked with intense concentration. His knuckles were white as he gripped the tool. The sound filled the quiet workshop. Crunch. Crunch. It was serrated with small crescent-shaped indentations from the pressure of the grozing iron. This scalloped edge was a hallmark of medieval glass. It was these small imperfections that would catch the light in the final window, contributing to its lively, sparkling quality. He worked for nearly an hour on that single piece of glass. He would nibble away a section, then hold the piece up, check it against the cartoon, and then continue. He used the smaller slot on the grozing iron for the tighter curves. Finally, the glass matched the charcoal line perfectly. He ran his thumb along the edge. It was sharp and serrated. It would fit snugly into the channel of the lead cane. He set the finished piece down in its tray and flexed his aching hand. There were 53 more pieces to cut for this saint's robe alone. It was the work of days. This method of cutting glass, scoring with a hot point, and then shaping with a grozing iron was the standard for centuries. The modern stained glass artist uses a steel wheel cutter to score the glass, which is far more precise and efficient. But for shaping a difficult curve after the initial cut or for removing a small, stubborn bit of glass, many artists will still reach for a pair of grozing pliers. The principle is the same to nibble away the glass, bit by bit. And the sound of modern grozing pliers, that distinct crunch, is the same sound of patient, risky work that filled Conrad's cold workshop in Cologne. Number 3, the whitewashed table, is the map of the entire creation. The master designer was not a simple craftsman. He was a scholar, an artist, and an engineer all in one. In the year 1200, in the lodge next to the rising cathedral of Chartres, he stood before a table that was the nerve center of the entire window-making operation. The table was immense, at least 15 feet long and 8 feet wide, made of thick, smooth planks of oak. Its surface was covered with a layer of plaster or gesso and whitewashed, creating a vast blank canvas. On this table lay the full-size drawing, the master plan, the cartoon. This particular cartoon was for one of the lancet windows of the north transept, a depiction of St. Anne holding the infant Virgin Mary. The design had been approved weeks ago by the cathedral chapter, a group of educated canons who had specified the subject matter and the theological details they wanted included. The master had first created a small, detailed drawing, a vitimus, on a piece of parchment. Now that small sketch had been scaled up by a grid system to its full and towering size on the table. He had drawn the entire window in charcoal with a sureness of hand that came from decades of practice. Every line was there. He had drawn the main figures, the architectural canopy above them, the patterned border. But his drawing was more than just a picture. It was a technical blueprint of immense complexity. He had drawn 2 types of lines. There were the broad, expressive lines that defined the folds of St. Anne's robe, the features of her face, the curls of Mary's hair. These lines would be rendered in vitreous paint on the surface of the glass, but he had also drawn a second set of lines, thicker and darker. These were the cut lines. These lines represented the heart of the lead games. They showed exactly how the window would be divided into hundreds of individual pieces of glass. Designing these cut lines was an art in itself. The master had to think like a glazier. He could not draw a shape that was impossible to cut from a fragile sheet of glass. An S-curve was difficult. A shape with an interior angle was impossible without a supporting lead line. He also used the lead lines as part of his drawing. He ran them along the contours of the figures using their dark graphic quality to reinforce the outlines and create a sense of weight and form. A lead line might define the edge of a sleeve, the curve of a shoulder, or the boundary between a robe and the background. With the drawing complete, he went over the cartoon again, adding a form of code. He used symbols and letters to indicate the color of each piece of glass. RAR for rouge, red, B for blue, V for vert, green. For a patterned background, he would simply write the instructions directly on the table, diaper pattern in red and blue. He also marked where the vitreous paint would be applied for shading and detail, but his job was still not done. He had to think about the window structure. He consulted with the blacksmith. Together, they planned the placement of the iron armatures. The master designer drew the lines for the horizontal saddle bars directly onto the cartoon, making sure they integrated with the design as much as possible. A bar might run along a horizontal element in the background or across the canopy work to make it less visually intrusive. He marked where the glaziers would need to solder copper ties to the lead to attach the panel to these bars. For the next several months, this table was the center of the workshop. The glass cutters would lay their sheets of colored glass directly over the cartoon and cut their pieces to match the lines. The painters would use it as their guide for the tracing and shading. The glaziers would assemble the final panels on top of the drawing, the charcoal lines visible through the glass, ensuring every piece fit perfectly. The cartoon on the whitewashed table was the single source of truth, the map that guided every artisan's hand. Today, the table might be a sheet of plywood or a large light box, and the drawing might be done on heavy paper or mylar. But the concept of the full-size cartoon, with its double set of lines for paint and lead, with its color coding and its structural marks, remains the indispensable first step in the creation of any traditional stained glass window. Number 2, the glassmaker's dance, was a battle against gravity and time. In the dense forests of the Sussex Weald, the air always held the scent of wood smoke. This was where the glassmakers lived and worked in the 14th century. And they built their furnaces where the fuel was, in the heart of the woods. It was a secretive and clannish trade, the skills passed down from father to son. Old man Hemming was the master blower of his small, family-run glass house. His son, Philip, aged 17, was his primary assistant. Their lives were dictated by the ferocious, unceasing hunger of the furnace. They were making crown glass. It was a physically demanding and beautiful process, a kind of dance with molten material. The furnace was a stone structure with 3 levels. The lowest level held the fire, a great roaring blaze of beech wood that had to be fed constantly. The middle level held the clay pots, the crucibles, where the mixture of sand, potash, and lime was heated for 2 days until it became a glowing honey-like liquid. The top level was the annealing oven, the leer, used for slowly cooling the finished glass. The process began at the glory hole, an opening into the furnace that gave access to the molten glass. Herr Hemming took a blowpipe, a hollow iron tube about 5 feet long. He was a powerfully built man, his arms corded with muscle from years of this work. He preheated the end of the pipe, then dipped it into the crucible, gathering a small gob of molten glass on the end. He pulled it out and rolled the glowing gob on a flat stone slab, a marver, to shape it and cool the outer skin slightly. Then he began to blow. He blew a short, controlled puff of air into the pipe, and a small bubble appeared in the glass. He would then hand the pipe to Philip. Philip's job was to stand on a raised platform and swing the pipe with the hot glass on the end in a long arc. The force of the swing elongated the bubble into a pear shape. He would hand it back to his father. Hemming would reheat the glass, blow some more, and give it back to Philip to swing again. This went on several times, each time the bubble growing larger and more spherical. Now came the critical moment. Another worker brought a Pontil, a solid iron rod with a small gather of hot glass on its tip. Hemming skillfully attached the pontil to the base of the glass bubble, directly opposite the blowpipe. With a sharp tap on the blowpipe with a piece of cold iron, the bubble cracked free. It was now held on the end of the solid pontil rod. All the end that was attached to the blowpipe was left with a hole. Hemming carried the bubble on the pontile back to the glory hole, this time with the hole facing the intense heat. He began to spin the pontil rod in his hand, slowly at first, then faster and faster. As the glass softened in the heat, the centrifugal force began to open the hole. The glass flared outwards like the bell of a trumpet. Hemming spun faster, a blur of motion. He had to be a master of timing. If he pulled the glass from the fire too soon, it wouldn't open. Too late, and it would melt into a, shapeless blob. He pulled it from the furnace at the perfect moment. The glass was now a wide, shallow bowl shape. Still spinning the pontil rod as fast as he could, the bowl continued to flatten out. Suddenly, with a distinctive whoosh sound, the sides of the bowl flew open completely, forming a large, flat, circular disc of glass. This was the crown. It was still glowing orange, spinning on the end of the pontil. The whole process from bubble to disc took only a minute or two. The disc was then broken off the pontil and carried to the lyre to cool slowly over a day. If it cooled too quickly, it would shatter. The finished crown was a disc of glass, perhaps 3 or 4 feet in diameter. It was not perfectly flat at the edge and thinner towards the middle. Right in the center was the bullseye, or bullion, the thick, knotty lump of glass where the pontile had been attached. The glass itself had swirling, circular ripples in it from the spinning process. For a glazier, this was both a blessing and a curse. They would have to carefully cut their rectangular or curved pieces from this round, uneven sheet, creating a lot of waste. But the slight imperfections and variations in thickness gave the glass a lively, shimmering quality that a perfectly flat, modern sheet of float glass can never replicate. This ancient, physically demanding technique is rarely practiced today for production, but a few artisan glassmakers keep the dance alive, creating authentic crown glass for historical restorations. Number 1, the cylinder method produced bigger, flatter, better glass. The knowledge came from the East. For centuries, Syrian and Egyptian glassmakers had used a different method, a technique that could produce larger and more uniform sheets of glass than the crown method popular in Northern Europe. This was the cylinder or muff method. Around the 13th and 14th centuries, as trade and crusading brought greater contact between cultures, this superior technology began to filter into Venice, and from there into the glassmaking regions of Lorraine and Germany. Imagine a master glass blower named Lothar, working in a forest glass house in Lorraine in the mid-1300s. He had learned this new method from a traveling Venetian artisan. His process started the same way as making crown glass. He gathered a gob of molten glass on his blowpipe. But from that point on, everything was different. Instead of trying to make a sphere, Lothar's goal was to make a long, even cylinder. After gathering the glass, he would let it hang vertically from the blowpipe, allowing gravity to stretch it downwards while he blew into the pipe. He would also swing the pipe in a deep pit dug into the floor of the workshop, using the pendulum motion to elongate the glass further. The result, after several reheats and careful blowing, was a long, hollow, sausage-shaped balloon of glass, sometimes 5 feet long and over a foot in diameter. It was a massive and unwieldy object of glowing, semi-liquid material. The next stage required precision. While the glass cylinder was still hot and attached to the pipe, Lothar would use a tool to flatten the bottom end. Then, by blowing hard, he could force the thinned, flattened end to burst open, creating a cylinder that was open at one end. The cylinder was then detached from the blowpipe, leaving it open at both ends with a giant glass tube. This tube was then laid on its side. Lothar took a long iron rod with a small tip of red-hot glass on the end. He drew this hot tip along the length of the cylinder from one end to the other, scoring a straight line. A drop of cold water on this line was enough to cause the cylinder to crack neatly all the way along its length. The final and most delicate stage was the flattening. The cracked cylinder was placed into another part of the furnace, a special annealing oven with a perfectly flat, smooth stone floor. This was the layer. As the glass tube heated up and began to soften, Lothar and his assistant used long iron tools called polissoirs to gently unfold the cylinder. They would push and pull, teasing the curved glass open along its crack until it lay flat on the stone floor. They would then use a block of wood on the end of a rod to iron out any remaining bumps or ripples, creating a remarkably flat and even sheet of glass. The sheet was then left to cool, or anneal, very slowly within the lyre. The glass produced by Lothar's method was revolutionary for cathedral builders. The sheets were larger than those made by the crown method. A glazier could get more usable glass from a single cylinder with less waste. Most importantly, the glass was of a consistent thickness, without the distracting swirls or the thick bull's eye of crown glass. This broad glass, as it was known, was perfect for the enormous windows of the later Gothic period. It allowed for larger individual pieces of glass in a design which meant fewer lead lines and a less cluttered appearance. The cylinder method was more technically complex than the crown method, but its advantages were so great that it eventually became the dominant way of producing high-quality flat glass for windows. It remained the primary method for making window glass right up until the early 20th century. When a restorer today analyzes a piece of glass from a 15th century window, they can often tell by the faint, parallel lines left from the flattening process that it was made by a man like Lothar, a master of the ancient and ingenious cylinder technique.